Hello everyone, we're going to get started with the evening's program. I'd like to welcome you all. My name's Joe. I'm a student here in the Twin Cities. I live over in St. Paul. Tonight's forum is going to be hosted by Socialist Alternative. We are the fastest growing socialist organization in the country. We are instrumental, probably, if you've heard of us outside of our work in Minneapolis, what you've probably heard of is Shama Sawant, who's a member of Socialist Alternative, who's now on the City Council in Seattle and was instrumental in passing that city's $15 an hour minimum wage ordinance. Tonight we're going to hear a talk from Ty Moore, who's a member of Socialist Alternative locally. He ran for City Council in Ward 9 in 2012? 2013, losing by only 230 votes, running as an outspoken socialist. Didn't try to hide it. Ty's now a member of the editorial board of Socialist Alternative and currently the organization director for 15 Now Minnesota. And tonight he's going to be giving a speech on building a political movement against the billionaire class.
So yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I think this discussion and the title of this discussion, I think, comes out of a growing radicalization that's happening across the country and really around the world. And I think in many ways, I'm not sure it always feels like this here in the U.S. as we go about our daily lives, but in many ways, I think if we look historically, we are passing through one of the most dramatic turning points in modern world history. I think historians will look back on the period, from the beginning of the Great Recession in 2008 up through our present day. In a similar way, they look back to the era around World War I and the Russian Revolution that opened up a new era of change. World War II or the collapse of the Soviet Union, these world-changing moments. And today, I think what is characterized this historical epic here in the U.S., but also internationally, are two main things. That global capitalism has, on the one hand, completely failed, is being seen by growing sections of the population worldwide to have completely failed not only to provide for the basic needs of humanity or the environment, that's been happening for a long time, but even by their own standards of trying to provide a stable basis for their own corporations to continue to make profits, to continue to exploit different corners of the world. As we see with the eruption of crisis throughout the Middle East, the growth of groups like ISIS, etc., even by their own standards, the capitalist class internationally is less and less able to maintain a stable global system for themselves. And on a global scale, you see the world leaders lurching from crisis to crisis. The recent refugee crisis in Europe, I think, is one of the best examples. We see as a result of the endless wars for control of the oil resources of the Middle East that the U.S., supported by Britain and other European powers, have waged. You see a situation, the fruits of that, where tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands by the end of this year, of refugees have completely given up on their nations of origin, have seen after decades of war and strife and interventions, have seen that there's no hope for a decent future for themselves or their children, their families, and are giving up everything, risking everything, as we've seen many even dying on the passage to attempt in a desperate way to live a decent life, to be able to survive. And it's provoking a deep crisis for the European capitalist powers, who on the one hand, have participated in this exploitation of the Middle East region where these refugees, and the northern Africa where the refugees are coming from, and cannot even hide that from their own citizens. There's huge movements and waves of protests of citizens reaching out and saying, we want to help. But on the other hand, because of the mass unemployment, because of the cuts to social programs, they're feeling their own systems being strained, and it's also giving rise to a far-right anti-immigrant mood that the far-right political parties are able to capitalize on, producing a serious crisis for those powers. And it's not incidental that the same debate, albeit in a less acute way, is developing here in the U.S. right now with Donald Trump openly proposing and getting significant support among sections of the working class even, openly proposing the mass deportation of 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, which there was a great infographic put out by AJ News, seen by several million people, that basically said, to achieve that would cost $11 trillion, would mean mass internment camps on the scale of the Japanese internment camp, where they paralleled it to the mass removal of Native Americans in the early period of this country. Really fascistic methods would be necessary to carry out this program. But we see that Donald Trump is nonetheless polling well amongst the Republican base because of the growing crisis of capitalism is opening up tremendous anger and room for these right populist politicians to win support for their racist, hateful ideas. We've seen capitalist system unable to manage the growing climate crisis. That the huge power of the big oil, coal, and other fossil fuel energy corporations are blocking all serious solutions to climate change, even as the impact of climate change worsens every year with extreme weather, drought, starvation, the spread of diseases. Many Republicans will still barely even acknowledge that the crisis exists, are in complete denial of the growing consensus amongst climate scientists. And meanwhile, the Democratic Party, politicians like Obama, while giving lip service to the climate crisis and offering token measures in solution, at the same time, under pressure, under the power of the oil corporations, has just allowed the Arctic to be opened up to drilling, one of the most dangerous, accident-prone projects that the oil industry internationally has ever engaged in. And we know that if we continue on the current path of excavating the last remaining oil, coal, and gas resources on the planet, that there's no way that we're going to be able to prevent catastrophic climate change that will dramatically change not just the weather patterns and the temperatures, but entire climatic regions, entire populations that are dependent upon agricultural regions that have been rich for hundreds and thousands of years and provided for the needs of entire nations like India, are going to dry up as the glaciers of the Himalayan mountains continuously melt into non-existence in the decades ahead. So we see capitalism completely incapable of dealing with these kinds of multi-layered crises because they continue to put the profits interests of big business, the short-term profit interests of big business, over the interests of humanity and the environment. There's also the question in our country of massive inequality that is increasingly dominating the political debate. Since Wall Street and the Fortune 500 companies crashed the U.S. economy in 2008, income inequality in the U.S. has reached a 100-year high. And despite the so-called recovery that has seen a huge recovery of profits for Wall Street, the bottom 90% of the U.S. population has seen no recovery. Wages have either stagnated or declined for the vast majority of the U.S. population. And while official unemployment is down to something close to 5%, there's been a number of really good studies that have come out and said, really have revealed the fiction that actually is. Even just a couple decades ago, the way that we calculated unemployment, they changed the formula in a significant way. So if you calculated unemployment the way, for instance, they did during the Reagan administration, no friend of working people, we would see an unemployment rate approximating 20% of the population right now, upwards of 40% for young people. And if you look at the question of, it's a jargony term, but the workforce participation rate, which is basically the percent of able-bodied work-age population that actually has a job. We're seeing the lowest workforce participation rate in the U.S. In the last few years than at any time since the Great Recession. So this is the future that capitalism offers to young people here in the U.S. and to workers here in the U.S. I graduated college in 2002. And my generation, Generation X, is said to be the first generation in U.S. history that is going to live poorer than their parents. And most people in this room, probably part of the millennial generation, you're going to do even worse. And I think that speaks volumes to the position and the declining position of U.S. capitalism and world capitalism internationally. We have a situation where for the first time in U.S. history, a majority of college graduates cannot find not even a job in their career. That's been a problem for a long time. But can't even find a job that requires a college degree. A majority of college graduates from the University of Minnesota for the last several years have faced that position. And so we see the condition, the sort of baristas with bachelor generation, where young people into their 20s, into their 30s, are stuck from low-wage job to low-wage job, but often saddled with the burden of tens of thousands of dollars of student debt that they're forced to pay off at ridiculously high interest rates. And this is a context that, not just today, but historically, every time capitalism has moved into a period of crisis, whenever mass anger, the lack of jobs, at poverty, at the lack of adequate social services, we see sections of the elite, sections of big business, propping up these right-wing populists who want to make scapegoats out of different sections of the population, be it immigrants, people of color, women, sexual minorities, anybody really but big business themselves or the political system that they represent, to say, this is the problems we're facing as a result of moral decay, of the feminist movement, of Black Lives Matter, and sections like that. And this is the basis of a lot of the support of groups like the Tea Party or figures like Donald Trump. But behind that, behind Fox News giving increasing support to these kind of figures, is the classic sort of divide and conquer method of trying to, instead of having people unite around their common interests, fighting for a greater share of the pie that big business is hoarding, they encourage people to fight amongst themselves. And so we're seeing, it's not a coincidence that at this moment, even as we see growing movements, as I'll get into, around figures like Bernie Sanders and left populist ideas, we're also seeing the growth of right populist support. And it's actually a real threat. A lot of people, I think, enjoy making fun of Donald Trump and the crazy stuff he says, and there is some pretty crazy stuff, and it is kind of, can be interesting to make fun. But I think we should not make light of what that represents, actually. And if we look at some other countries that have faced deeper crisis, in Europe, in Greece, in Eastern Europe, even in the UK, where a party called UKIP, a right-wing nationalist party with roots actually in the Nazi movement, has made huge electoral gains. And and we've seen out-and-out fascist parties like in Greece, where the crisis is deepened, make huge electoral gains. And it can be funny, sometimes to make fun of them, but I think from the point of view of most immigrants, from the point of view of women, from the point of view of racial minorities, this is not a laughing matter. It's a serious threat that figures like this are being given the scale of support they are in society. It's not a coincidence at this same time, despite actually popular support for a women's right to choose at historic highs, despite that, the campaign to shut down Planned Parenthood centers across there's arson attacks, this scandalous sort of totally baseless right-wing attack campaign about selling fetal tissue, etc. That's just it's a media sensation. It's a right-wing invention, but nonetheless is being successful at massive defunding, making it impossible for women in huge regions of the country. A huge majority of counties now have no real access to an abortion provider. This is also the context in which we see racist police killings continue to be justified in the mass media, with portrayals of people of color as dangerous as criminal. The U.S. population, thank you. It is. U.S. has 5% of the world's population. We house 25% of the world's prison population. We have the highest per capita prison population of any nation on earth, higher than communist China, higher than dictatorships in the Middle East or Latin America. And it reflects the racist traditions of U.S. capitalism, as a growing body of literature has been exploring. It's the idea of this being the new Jim Crow, the mass incarceration that overwhelmingly targets people of color, has been growing, increasingly accepted amongst in the people who are fighting this. So we see a whole host of issues that I think at root reflect the inability of capitalism to meet the basic needs of a growing majority of humanity, of a growing majority of working people here in the U.S. And a searching for an alternative, searching for a way out, searching for a way to solve this problem. And we see the danger on the right, but what I think is also hopeful, what makes me excited about the era that we're living in, is there's also a growing searching for an alternative. There's a growing awareness that multinational corporations that have accumulated unprecedented levels of wealth, that exercise unprecedented levels of domination and control over the entire nation states, that they've gone too far, that this system is fundamentally rigged against ordinary people, and that some massive kind of change is necessary. So we see these conditions producing a wave of popular resistance, of left-wing movements developing around the world to fight back and transform society in the interests of ordinary people. In 2011, we saw the sort of initial wave of revolt since that economic crisis beginning in revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, which overthrew US-backed dictatorships, moving into Wisconsin, where we saw working-class union households fighting against Scott Walker, holding up signs, say they kicked out Mubarak in Egypt, we can do it here in Madison as well, expressing sort of the organic sense of solidarity that began to develop amongst working people worldwide. And there was waves of revolt across Europe, across the Middle East, Latin America, et cetera, and culminating in a certain sense in the Occupy Wall Street movement that really transformed the popular discussion here in the US, coining terms like the 1% and the 99%, giving a certain idea of the class differences on the class basis of the social problems. Now, Occupy fundamentally transformed the conversation, repopularizing the idea that another world was possible, that inequality was not inevitable. And by early 2012, polls showed, Occupy was mainly against capitalism, against corporate control. It didn't really articulate a coherent alternative. But by early 2012, polls showed that for the first time since like the 70s, a majority of young people said they prefer socialism to capitalism. An even bigger majority of African Americans said they prefer socialism to capitalism. Now, what people mean by socialism is not, super coherent. And what they mean by capitalism is not super coherent. But I think it underscores the opening, the searching for an alternative that exists, particularly amongst the younger generation. From Black Lives Matter to the fight for $15 minimum wage to the Bernie Sanders campaign, all of these, I think, in some ways, are the result of the changed political situation that was opened up in 2011 and that's continued to be developed in the movements of the current day. I won't have time. Maybe someone can come into the discussion to discuss the phenomenon in Britain where Jeremy Corbyn, one of the most left-wing members of the Labour Party, came out of nowhere to sweep into a huge victory, to take power in the second most powerful party in British politics, the Labour Party, promising a very far-reaching socialist, pro-working class, anti-war, pro-refugee position. The day after his acceptance speech of the Labour Party, the first sort of act was to go to a solidarity demonstration for the refugees, saying, the Labour Party in Britain invite you in. The war that our country participated in that caused this refugee crisis was a mistake, and Britain should be a welcoming place for refugees and take responsibility for the crises that they have helped create, their capitalist class has helped create. Things have gotten, I think, to such a point where even many mainstream capitalist commentators, like New York Times columnist Roger Cohen, is forced to acknowledge, in a column he wrote a couple weeks ago, he said, quote, "This is a season of radical discontent. People believe the system is rigged. They have good reason. Rigged in favor of the super rich, rigged to accumulate and accentuate inequality, rigged to hide the huge increases in the cost of living, rigged to buy elections, rigged to put off retirement, rigged to eviscerate pensions, rigged to export jobs, rigged to sabotage equal opportunity, rigged to hurt the middle class and minorities and the poor. Increasingly, unequal societies have spawned anger and unsurprising development. The anger is diffuse, in search of somebody to articulate it. That column was his attempt to describe the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in the presidential elections, and it is significant. Political support for the so-called political center, for the mainstream corporate-dominated candidates of the Democratic and Republican parties, popular discontent and frustration with them is at record highs, and this is shown in the poll numbers. Congress has something like a 15% favorability rating. There's a funny poll that comes out is like, do you like or dislike cockroaches? Do you like or dislike lots of things? Cockroaches are more popular in this country than Congress right now. Most people said if they could pick a random person in the phone book to replace their congressman, they would. I think it's this is sort of reflects sort of the, not a very coherent, worked out sense of an alternative, but just the sort of complete discrediting that the existing political establishment has received and the searching for a political alternative. Now, the Sanders campaign, I think, is a stunning development. Nobody, even Sanders himself, not our organization, we were very enthusiastic when Sanders articulated, but I don't think anybody expected the meteoric rise of popularity. Within a week or two of his campaign, he came to Minneapolis and had one of the first of what quickly developed into a series of super rallies when they booked a room for, I think, 200 people first, and over 3,000 people packed in, and there was another couple thousand standing room only outside the American Indian Center, just a couple miles from here. And he's gone on to have series of mass demonstrations numbering 10, 20, 30,000 people all across the country. No other candidate has been able to track that kind of support. He's received his campaign contributions, his average of around $35 campaign contributions, more campaign contributions than all the Republican candidates combined in terms of number of people donating, more than Hillary Clinton, et cetera. Of course, he's trailing because he's refusing corporate donations, he refuses any PAC money, et cetera. But I think it's this kind of clear class appeal that he's put forward, clear calls against the billionaire class that he's put forward, putting forward positions like a $15 minimum wage, single-payer national health care, free college education, a $1 trillion jobs program, massive investment in green energy jobs to transition away from fossil fuel energy sources. These ideas that have mass popular support, but have up to this point not received, not had a figure that it was articulating with the scale that Sanders has been able to. I think it indicates what is possible, that it is actually possible to build a mass, working class, socialist alternative in this country. Now, Bernie Sanders calls himself a socialist, a democratic socialist. And I think it's worth, I'll get into a little bit more describing. We have important disagreements with Sanders, the Socialist Alternative does, over aspects of his policy. I mean, on the questions of foreign policy, for example, Sanders has voted against the Iraq War, but he voted in favor of the Afghanistan War. He's voted in favor of U.S. aid to Israel, which we think is a criminal policy, et cetera. I think he's made a lot of mistakes in that field. And we also have a significant strategic or tactical disagreement that he's running inside the Democratic Party. Now, given the obstacles to building a left-wing independent alternative, there's a certain, it's understandable in a certain sense that Sanders, as an independent, would choose to attempt to use the Democratic Party platform. And on the surface, it seems he's done quite well on that. But the Democratic Party primary process is a fundamentally rigged process. And we've seen this again and again with figures in the past like Kucinich or Howard Dean or going back to the 80s, Jesse Jackson's campaign, people who've studied history, or a few people in the room who remember these campaigns, where even candidates who do quite well, who have majority support in the base because of the corporate media, because of the manipulation of the electoral process. I mean, just to give one example, it's not just winning. Bernie Sanders doesn't just need to win the popular vote to win the Democratic primaries. He also needs to win something called the superdelegates. And they don't talk about the superdelegates very much. But every congressperson, every senator, the Democratic gets a vote. They're a superdelegate. State leadership parties can appoint a certain number of superdelegates. And so far, Hillary Clinton has a majority of the superdelegates wrapped up. Bernie Sanders is a U.S. senator. He has 0 U.S. senators supporting his campaign. Hillary Clinton has 30, just to give you a sense of where the Democratic Party establishment is at. If Hillary Clinton can wrap up the superdelegates, Bernie Sanders won't need to get a majority. He will need to get over 75% of the popular vote in the primary process to be able to overcome the Clinton obstacle. Unfortunately, we think the overwhelmingly likely perspective is that the corporate-dominated political machine, with the aid of the corporate media, is going to, at a certain stage, tank the momentum inside the primary process. That doesn't mean Sanders is unpopular. In fact, if you look at polls putting Sanders up against the key Republican leaders in a presidential contest, he does as well. He's on par with how well Hillary Clinton is doing. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that. What we've urged is that Sanders run as an independent. He should point out the rigged process and say, we need to take this momentum, build our own independent party that is completely free of corporate cash, that rests on the activist base of working class people. Look what we've achieved so far. We can build our own party in this country. And even if he doesn't win the presidential elections on that basis, if he can get 15, 20, 30% of the vote, that would transform the U.S. political situation and open up a new political era in the country where working people would have a political expression to unite the various social movements into a common organization, giving it a common program, providing the basis at the city, local, and state level to begin building a movement to challenge the billionaire class in a more sustained way. So we are advocating that he take that step. Now, Socialist Alternative, just to wrap up, our organization has been active for many years in struggles from labor rights and trade union struggles for immigrant rights, for the environmental movements, student movements against the war, etc. But as Joe said in the beginning, our role on the U.S. left has been transformed over the last period. In 2013, after Occupy, we argued that Occupy should run 200 candidates in the elections, that we shouldn't allow this movement to get swept into the 2012 presidential elections, which most of it did. That call didn't get heeded by very many people, but we tried it out. And in Seattle, we got a tremendous echo. We defied all the political commentators by running as an open, in Seattle and here in Minneapolis actually, openly as socialist alternative candidates, putting forward ideas that at that time were still quite radical for a $15 minimum wage. Nobody else was talking about that at that stage. The fast food workers were saying McDonald's should pay $15, but it wasn't a minimum wage debate. Talking about a moratorium on foreclosures, saying that big business should be forced to massively increase their taxation, to provide for the basic social programs for working people, and then fundamentally articulating that we think a different type of society is necessary. And the movements of today should be linked toward the idea of a democratic control over the economy to provide for the basic needs of everyone, that it's not necessary to continue to live in poverty, to continue environmental degradation. Now, most people said that's impossible. You're not going to get support, thumbs up for trying, etc. But Shama Sawant's campaign and our campaign, I think, defied all expectations. In Seattle, where she was running a citywide campaign, we won against a 16-year Democratic Party incumbent, winning nearly 100,000 votes for a clear socialist profile, without any establishment support, barely any trade union support, but because of the grassroots momentum and because of the anger of so many voters, didn't think we were going to win, but they voted for Shama Sawant, saying, this is just a protest to stick it to City Hall. We also came within 230 votes of winning and built the strongest grassroots effort of any city council campaign in this country. I know some people in the room were part of that. Now, Shama was able to take that momentum and translate it into launching 15 Now, which led the movement in Seattle to win the first $15 minimum wage in the country that is now spread to California, to Los Angeles, San Francisco, and movements developing across the country, including here in Minneapolis. Our organization has grown a lot over the has nearly tripled since that election victory, and we really want to invite all of you to be part of that process of growing the socialist movement. So if you're interested, you like what you hear tonight, we'd really like you to join. But I want to just end by talking a little bit about what we mean by socialism. I think one of the characteristics of this historic period is, there's a tremendous anger at the present system, but there's not a clear understanding of what the alternative would look like. Now, we don't picture socialism just to be this sort of utopian vision, and we're going to have a bunch of meetings like this, and eventually we'll get a majority for this vision, and we'll just be able to vote socialism into being. We see socialism historically, the idea of the alternative type of society is organically comes out of the movements of working people. I like to use the example in a workplace of a trade union. At first, trade unions are formed simply because workers recognize if we're isolated, how can we negotiate with our boss who can just fire us if we get upset? But if we unite together, threaten to withhold our labor, we have leverage, we have power, and we can begin to control aspects of our workplace, our pay, how much of the profits the boss shares with us. Strong unions will even control things like hours and break time, hiring and firing practices. When society moves into a revolutionary period, and there's been a lot of examples, a union can begin to ask the question, well, what does the boss do that we can't do? Why can't we run this company ourselves? I used to be a bus driver. Now buses are public entity, it's a little whatever, but If drivers democratically elected the management team, if we ran our own bus company, I promise you that would be a more effective, better bus company. We'd keep fares down. We'd be more on time. We'd have an expansive system. We'd unite with ordinary people to fight to tax the rich, to ensure that the continuous expansion of the transit system. And I think that would be true of this university. It would be true of most restaurants. It would be true of most institutions in society. And that's basically what a socialist vision is. It says that as long as the major corporations, the big banks, the oil companies, the agricultural industry is run on a for-profit basis, where they're making decisions not on how to provide the healthiest, best food for people, but they're trying to make a profit, not how to provide the most effective energy sources to get us around and to keep the lights on, but how to make a profit. When this is the basis of society, there's no way that the right decisions for the majority are going to be made. It's only if we democratically control the resources and the wealth that we collectively produce that we're going to be able to manage and transition society to meet the basic needs of humanity and the environment. And that's what a socialist vision of society is. That's what we fight for. So we'd really encourage everybody to get involved. Locally, Socialist Alternative is very active in a number of different campaigns. The biggest fight that we're involved in for $15 minimum wage here, we helped launch 15 Now, and along with a lot of other community activists, low-wage workers, union activists, we're fighting to put $15 an hour on the ballot next year here in Minneapolis to make Minneapolis the first the first city outside the West Coast to win a $15 minimum wage. Now that would be a net transfer of wealth annually of $900 million from the pockets of the employers to the pockets of working class people here. It would disproportionately impact women and people of color who are concentrated in low-wage jobs. So we see this as a crucial fight in the growing fight for racial equity, for gender equity, and the fight against economic inequality and big business control. Target, US Bank, the other big corporations that dominate Minneapolis politics, they are already fighting tooth and nail to make sure this doesn't see the light of day. We've gone to every city council member, and we have a number of allies on the council, but we also know business has gone to them, and still a majority of the council oppose a $15 minimum wage. So that's why we're moving in the direction of a ballot initiative to bypass the council and to say, we're confident ordinary people will see through the lies and this is going to lose jobs, etc., and support the idea that every worker deserves a basic living wage, and $15 is an important step in that direction. So we're going to need all of your help to win that fight. It's not just Socialist Alternative, it's a broader movement, so you can get involved in that too. But Socialist Alternative has been at the core of that struggle. We really invite you to get involved, join our organization, and help build a movement for a better world. Thank you.